So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Vittorio Gallesi, trained neurologist and professor of psychobiology at the University of Parma, professor of experimental aesthetic at the University of London, and research fellow at the Department of Art and History and Archaeology at Columbia University. So without taking any thunder of this upcoming talk, Gallesi is well known for his groundbreaking work and co-discovery of mirror neurons, and is since interested in a variety of fields that touches the frontiers of science and humanities. And this is nice because it's like an ambassador of these different worlds that must interact to advance our scientific understanding. And by the way, I hope that some audience from the local science and humanities bachelor's program joined us today. So more specifically, Professor Gallesi is interested in the relationship between the sensory motor system and cognition in primates. So in macaques, he uses single neurons recordings, and in humans, imaging techniques, TMS, and behavioral and electrophysiological methods. And in recent years, he broadened this research interest towards cognitive science. So for example, by studying the neurobiological basis of embodied simulations and the experience of art, as he will present today, and which has also been a great influence on me and to us. And if you don't know what to do during your free evenings, I can only invite you to read or listen on YouTube to his truly inspiring discussions with famous American novelist Siri Hustvedt. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation again. Please, Professor Gallesi, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank to you and to all the people you were mentioning at the beginning of this session that kindly invited me to give this talk and to share and discuss together ideas. So I'll start by sharing the screen. And I hope you can all see the first slide.
Perfect, it works. We see a slide and the animation works as well.
Great, great. So embodied simulation and experimental aesthetics. This is going to be, by the way, I realized just before beginning that there is a French trail along the slides that I'll be using to give my talk today. And the first connection here is because of this image, which comes from Blombos Cave in South Africa, that has been studied by important scholars based in France. Okay, this is the outline of my talk. There will be just an introductory, very short part to kind of present my credentials. Where do I come from? What is my theoretical background in neuroscience? Then I will begin addressing the main topic, aesthetics and aesthetic experience. How do we embody images? I'll introduce embodied simulation as a model of perception and imagination. And in the last part of the talk, I will present briefly, concisely, few empirical results that we obtained in the last 10 years or so on these topics. Okay. So we start, you see, with France. This is an edited book, edited by a French philosopher, Jean-Luc Petit, which back then was based in Strasbourg University. Later on, he worked for many years with Alain Berthoz in Paris. Le neurosciences et la philosophie de l'action. We were invited, Giacomo and I, to contribute a chapter because after learning about the discovery of mirror neurons through a BBS paper by Marc Jeanneret on motor simulation, where he spoke about mirror neurons, and I think that was the beginning of the interest in mirror neurons in France, mainly driven by Marc's remarkable open peer commentary paper in BBS. So Jean-Luc wrote to us, to Giacomo, And he said, you should read Husserl, the Cartesian Fifth Meditation. It's all about that. I must come to Parma. And so it happened. So Jean-Luc gave a talk. Most of our colleagues were listening to a French philosopher at the Institute of Physiology for the very first time in their life. So that talk had quite an impact. So this to tell that pretty soon after the discovery of mirror neurons, we try hard to think about the theoretical purchase, the possible heuristic value of this neurophysiological mechanism. I keep stressing, I don't want to talk about mirror neurons. I want to talk about mirroring. I want to talk about a neurophysiological mechanism instantiated by a variety of neurons scattered in many different parts of the brain of many different animal species. Okay, first quote, the neurophysiological data we have presented here, we talked about canonical neurons and mirror neurons, provide a new insight about the neural mechanisms that might underpin the processes of object categorization and action understanding. Both these processes, in our perspective, seem to be deeply grounded in the bidirectional relationship between agent and environment. This relationship is basically dependent upon action execution. Action appears to represent the founding principle of our knowledge of the world, which means I am a motor chauvinist. I tend to see things from an active point of view. Second step, I went to Tucson in '98 towards a Science of Consciousness meeting where I met Alvin Goldman, Thomas Metzinger, who invited me the next year to a meeting in Bremen on the topic of consciousness. The result was this chapter, the acting subject, towards the neural basis of social cognition, where I wrote, our complex experience of the world is made out of simpler behavioral mechanisms, very much as our cortical circuits are made of neurons whose activities intermediate out of the ions flow. In other words, among all these different levels of description, there is no ontological gap to be crossed, just a continuum of increasing organizational complexity. Neurophysiology, in this view, represents a sort of cognitive archaeology. More than 20 years later, I still would subscribe entirely this piece of prose. I still believe that one of the main heuristic value of cognitive neuroscience, but particularly of cognitive neurophysiology, I remain and always will be deeply a neurophysiologist. I think one of the most interesting purchase of this approach to cognition, the mind, human nature, who we are, whatever your perspective on the topic of what does it mean to be human, basically all the questions, in my opinion, revolve around this very foundational one. Well, the purchase of cognitive neuroscience, and in particular with the approach that has the purpose to identify specific electrical mechanisms that accompany, possibly in a specific correlational way. Once in a while, we get to the possibility to even establish causal relationships between brain states, body states, and cognitive behavior. The purchase is that we have the possibility to shed light on the natural, neurobiological, physiological building blocks that are employed to get to symbols, to get to culture, to get to what we now call art or aesthetics. Cognitive archaeology in this specific sense, that we can, once we decide to adopt a methodological reductionist approach, which means trying to unpack the concept, the notion that we employ to describe, to talk about our relation to a painting, a movie, a novel, a poem. We want to go to the basic roots that enable what we call cognition, which in the case of the human species includes what we now call art and aesthetics. And so the mechanism I will talk about today, this afternoon, and the hypothetical, theoretical model that I'm using as a common encasing framework to provide coherence to all these bits of disparate empirical evidence, embodied simulation is something that enables to argue that the brain level of description is necessary but not sufficient for studying who we are, intersubjectivity, the human self, language. Why? Because all these big questions that we are, our work consists in addressing empirically these questions, can be addressed only if we couple the methodological approach of cognitive neuroscience with the full appreciation of the intertwined relationship between brain and body. We can do excellent neuroscience forgetting about the body, focusing on the computational level of description of the brain machine, but that's a different story. I don't think that that kind of approach can tell us something new or something more about what I want to talk about, which is, for example, aesthetic experience or the experience of space or empathy or the use of linguistic metaphors and the like. So embodied simulation from a functional point of view can be described as the suspension of the usual application of a neurophysiological process, which normally serves the purpose to set the body in motion. When the motor system ignites, you move your body, not all the time. That's the new thing. Your motor system or part of it ignites, but you don't move. You simulate movement while you're observing movement, while you are imagining your movement or the movement of someone else, or when you read about the movement of someone else, or you hear someone talking about the movement of someone else. This, to use the framework which I fully endorse, provided by Michael Anderson, I used to say neural exploitation. Stan Dehaene spoke of neural recycling. I think reuse is simpler, perhaps more minimalist, less dramatic as a term, but serves the purpose. It's enough clear what they designate. Reuse of neural motor maps without the movements they normally determine is conceived as a case of activation of paradigmatic knowledge, which means rosa means a flower, but means also a declension in the Latin language. Rosa, rose, etc., etc. So you suspend the referential role of that specific word. That word doesn't designate anymore a natural kind. It becomes a paradigmatic rule, which include all the possible instantiations of a rose. This is Aristotle through the filter of Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher. So the display of the rule exhibited in each individual case of actual occurrence, every time a mirror neuron fire, when the monkey doesn't move any part of of her body constitutes the paradigm, say, of the grasping. A grasping doesn't happen in the monkey's body. There is a grasping out there, but that grasping out there, as perceived, ignites a simulation of that particular motor schema, which constitutes a rule, a biological regularity, Wittgenstein would say. So no matter if this display of the grasping, for example, occurs when the action is performed, observed, or imagined, it accomplishes its ruling role because of a pre-existing biological norm and constraint which make it possible, which is basically our bodily nature, the way our body is built and functioning. We can run, we can jump, we can't fly unless we catch a plane, okay? So in Aristotle's paradigma, which is from paradeiknomi, something that comes along, that stays beside, is an example, a particular case, which nevertheless in rhetoric is understood because it proceeds from what is best known and first for us. That is, in my translation, close to our feelings, to our experiences, to our baggage of implicit memories, which are, for the most of the cases, performative bodily memories. So our experiences are therefore the measure from which we understand others, their experiences, and their representations of experiences, alien to us. Other experiences are at the same time for us a condition for a deeper understanding of ourselves, because there is always a chiasmatic relationship, which, because of the relation and because of the experiences, solidify, so to speak, in two dynamic poles, the subject and the object, or I and do, or I and it, okay? So this is a kind of general background to introduce the topic of today, aesthetics. And I want to start with Mark Johnson. The same Mark Johnson that in the early 80s with George Lakoff wrote a capital book for the embodied cognition paradigm, whose title was Metaphors We Live By. Here in 2018, in The Aesthetics of Meaning and Thought, Mark wrote, begin quote, aesthetics extends broadly to encompass all the processes by which we enact meaning through perception, bodily movement, feeling, and imagination. In other words, all meaningful experience is aesthetic experience, end quote. And the red emphasis is mine. So how do you want to designate this approach? We could call it a general epoche of the specific meaning of the notion aesthetics and aesthetic experience that historically was formed basically starting from the 18th century with the birth of aesthetic as a discipline in itself. What Mark Johnson means is that two things: the centrality of experience, and within the centrality of experience, all meaningful experience is made through the sensing body, therefore qualifies as aesthetics. Because aesthesis is specifically that. The multimodal, translated with a more modern language, aesthesis is the multimodal perception of the world through the body. And when I started venturing in this field of experimental aesthetics, prepared by a long theoretical dialogue, collaboration with David Friedberg, that translated in this first joint paper that appeared in 2007, indeed, our first move was to bracket the so-called artistic dimension of visual works of art to focus on the embodied phenomena induced when beholding man-made images that we now designate as paintings, sculptures, and the like. And we proposed a neural story about what's going on. How is this particular experience accomplished? And the first point is, if you want to understand how this particular experience of those particular objects is accomplished, the first smart move is to bracket the specificity and to treat those man-made images as images, qua images, okay? I first met David through the reading of his book, The Power of Images, which is a landmark in aesthetics, together with a bunch of other books like The Anthropology of Images by Hans Belting, or The Theory of the Iconic Act by Horst Bredekamp. But in a way, David was anticipating both with his books. And the topic of that book was the power that images exert on us. A power so great that as humans, we indulge in iconoclasty, namely, just because we feel that some images are too powerful, we destroy them. And we have had the illustration of these activities also very, very recently in Syria, for example. So we proposed in this paper that embodied simulation and the empathic feelings, states generated by the activation of this mechanism could play a crucial role in aesthetic experience. So what is an experience? And I, since quite a few years, I'm finding more and more relevant the theoretical contribution of American pragmatism, particularly in this domain, the contribution of John Dewey, which non-coincidentally, as we speak, for example, in Italy, is very much discussed, republished, retranslated. There are many books that are coming out this year, last year, on empirical aesthetics, on theoretical aesthetics that are deeply indebted with, particularly with this book, Artist's Experience, that Dewey published in 1934, where he defines experience as follows. Begin quote. Experience is the result, the sign, and the reward of that interaction of organism and environment, which, when it is carried to the full, is a transformation of interaction into participation and communication. The red emphasis is always mine. So in order to define what an experience is all about, it is not sufficient to speak of an interaction. Not all forms of interaction qualify as full-blown experiences. In order to qualify as experiences, interaction must transform into participation and communication. So participation and communication, in my opinion, are two sides of the same coin. So the possibility to experience alterity within a common we-centric framework of similarity. You need to have similarity and alterity combined in order to entertain, let's say, a healthy intersubjective relation. When we speak of aesthetic experience, very handy is the approach by Hans Gumbrecht, that in the production of presence, what meaning cannot convey, 2004, Gumbrecht argues what we call aesthetic experience always provides us with certain feelings of intensity we cannot find in the historically and culturally specific everyday worlds that we inhabit. So here we have already a very interesting connotation that we should bear in mind and keep with us for the rest of my talk, namely that there is something specific in what we call aesthetic experience. So what is specific is the quality of the experience that I'm more and more inclined to think can be largely independent of the quality of the object or of the quality of the gaze. It is the combination of the gaze of the object within a specifically situated existential context that make the specificity of the aesthetic experience, which in my opinion, we shouldn't take as universally granted, but this is something I don't want to be too long. I mean, maybe we can discuss that in the end if something picks that as something that would require any further discussion. So what are we up to? This is one of the questions that I like to use to annoy my students in the lab. What are we doing? So what are our questions? What are we here for? Why are we spending all this time investing efforts in creating experimental paradigm with a variety of experience, of approaches, techniques, and the like. So what is the purpose of all this? And my purpose is to shed light as much as possible on the genesis of aesthetic experience. So the experience of images can be empirically studied to reveal its bodily and neurobiological grounding elements. Am I implying that all there is in the aesthetic experience of images are their bodily and neurobiological grounding elements? We can respond yes or no to this specific question for very good reasons. I mean, we can answer yes, because it's basically a truism. If we are monist, everything in the end has to be in some way or form reduced to a physical, which means also a neurobiological and bodily grounding elements. But it's true, but doesn't explain much. So the experience of images can be empirically studied to reveal its bodily grounding elements, can be answered positively, and this is my case, in a more interesting way, implying that there are other ways to talk about aesthetic experience. These ways have been thoroughly explored along the millennia, at the very least, starting with Plato. What we are talking about is a kind of complementary approach to the very same questions that designate from the very beginning a different level of description, a subpersonal level of description, a functional level of description, a neurophysiological level of description, a single neuron level of description. This is what this is all about. Why? What's the purchase of this particular approach? Hopefully, a better understanding of what the concepts referring to aesthetics and art are made of. The cognitive archaeology I began with. So, how do we embody images? My approach to these topics is still, unfortunately, I mean, I'm not happy or proud of that, but I would say still unconventional. Why? Because the starting assumption at least three starting assumptions, are quite different, to be honest, from the mainstream neuroscientific approach to aesthetics. And let me tell you, I am experiencing that also in terms of funding. So that's why I said I'm not particularly proud or happy of the unconventionality of my approach. First point, vision is far more complex than the mere activation of the so-called visual brain. Why? Because it can be hardly denied because there is rock solid empirical evidence attesting for that. Our visual experience of the world is the outcome of multimodal integration processes. And the key player, in my opinion, of this integration process is the motor system. Second, aesthetic experience must be framed within a broader framework, social cognition and intersubjectivity. Why? Because what we now designate as works of art, cultural artifacts, symbols, are always mediators of the relationship between the subjectivities of creator and beholder. Third, which is a consequence of the second point, aesthetic experience is a particular kind of social practice, of a social habit or habitus, to use Bourdieu term. So our enemy is the visual brain imperialism in this matter. Observing the world is multimodal. It encompasses the activation of motor, somatosensory, emotional related brain networks. Furthermore, as I said, another distinctive quality of our motor system is that it instantiates motor potentialities. And our motor potentialities are the key player to draw, to design, to shape, to define our Umwelt, the world that we inhabit, the world where we perform, the world that we perceive, the world that we represent. Our brain body expresses the range of potential relationship with the world that lead to the establishment of a relational self, modeling and delimiting the horizon of the world in which we live. This Umwelt, we know it, we understand it, we find ourselves at home within it when everything works properly, so to speak, by virtue of the relational potentialities which are instantiated by our body, which in turn shape and model the brain's sensory motor schemas that we use to guide our performative exploration and adaptation to the environment, but that we reuse to map, represent, experience that very same world. So this reuse of the motor system has been identified in a variety of part of the motor part of the brain. Here you see a lateral view of the macaque lateral hemisphere. In color, the areas that in the premotor and posterior parietal part of the brain entertain bidirectional parallel connection. So there is a series of parallel parietal premotor bidirectional connections that functionally support distinct behavioral properties. For example, if you go in this part, which is in between the area where we discover canonical and mirror neurons on the one hand, and posteriorly, the primary motor cortex sits area F4, whose motor neuron control orienting or avoiding movement of the head, reaching movement of the arm. The same motor neuron, when the macaque doesn't move, if stimulated tactily on the very same body part, would respond. If you approach visual stimuli to the same body part, the very same neuron would map also that. or even if a sound occurs within that proximity of that very same body part whose movement is controlled by that very same neuron will respond also to that sound. Or to move forward in area F5, canonical neurons control the visual motor transformation of the shape or size of an object into the motor schema most suitable to do things with that object. For example, grasping it, to take possession of it. But the very same neuron, in absence of any movement, would selectively respond visually to the very same object whose grasping that neuron controls, with a high degree, in many cases, of specificity. So, and in humans, if you stimulate the equivalent part of the premotor part of the human brain, you have a causal impact in the recognition of three-dimensional objects present physically present in front of participants. So frontoparietal motor areas are neurally integrated not only to control action, but these circuits are reused also to build an integrated bodily formatted, because as I said, the body and what the body can do constrains its motor potentialities and the way those are mapped and controlled at the level of the brain, a mapping of actions, of three-dimensional objects, of peripersonal locations to which actions are directed. Peripersonal space, the possibility to have hemispatial neglect dissociable for peripersonal versus extrapersonal space, the possibility to modify the depth of peripersonal space by means of the use of tools in macaques, as first shown and later on in humans, are all instantiations of this reuse, simulative reuse of this part of the brain, of the sensory motor system. So, in order to speak of aesthetic experience of man-made images, we speak of a mediated form of intersubjectivity. So the discovery of mirror neurons brought on the table the intercorporeal side of intersubjectivity. All the qualities that link the I and the thou that has been discussed from a variety of perspectives in philosophy and psychology, there is an added level of description after the discovery of mirror neurons, the level of a neurophysiological mechanism that links action execution with the perception of action of others through the activation of this mechanism instantiated by neurons that in the first place we discovered in the ventral part of the premotor cortex of the macaque. So neurons that guide the execution together with the other neurons of the grasping of objects, but also responding to the observation of similar motor acts performed by other individuals. More recently, our colleagues at the University of Tübingen were able to show that the very same mechanism in premotor area F5 practically respond both to the experience of a naturalistic action performed by the experimenter physically present in front of the macaque, but also when the macaque just perceived the mere digital bidimensional representation of the very same action. So we can say that in principle, we compare the world of physical reality with the world of movies, of fiction, in a non-human primate species, which approximately is far away, about 25 millions from a common ancestor with respect to Homo sapiens, practically the entirety of the population of mirror neuron tested with this paradigm respond to both. Half practically with the same intensity to the naturalistic action as well as to the film action. The remaining half respond more vigorously to the naturalistic action, but show equally strong specific response to the film action, which means that as primates, our brain are so tuned to the perception of the actions of others that this tuning somehow is not, the medium is not a filter, be it the naked eye or a digitally mediated experience. This mediation is not strong enough to wipe out this reciprocal mapping of interpersonal action. So quickly, moving to the human brain, this colorful part of the human brain turned out to be activated by the execution, by the observation, but also by, as I said before, by the imagination of goal-directed action, communicative actions, or apparently gratuitous body movements. And even when we behold the static image of an action, the more dynamic is the static image of an action, the stronger is the driving of the motor system of the still beholder. Let's speak about imagination. So what I'm going to show you now is exactly the same scene that was observed by the macaque from which we were recording the single mirror neuron you're going to hear in a few seconds. We tested a population of neurons one by one. I'm very envious of the multi-probe devices that my younger colleagues are using upstairs, because simultaneously they record more than 100 neurons, while back then with micro tungsten electrodes, we were recording single neurons one by one. And in order to do a testing like the one I'm going to show you, you need to keep the very same neuron alive for about an hour or so. So first, the macaque observed the grasping action. And you listen to the spiking noise of the neuron. And to be honest, I really missed a lot. I'm not doing single neuron recording, but I wouldn't hear it anymore because now it's all offline correlation. I like to talk about that with the students later on. Okay, but let's keep that for later. What happens if we pantomime the action? Practically nothing. A macaque would never pay a ticket to see Marcel Marceau. The macaque most probably wouldn't get anything out of that. It seems to require the presence of the object to transform that body displacement into a motor act. But now the crucial testing, what happens if the interaction between the hand and the object cannot be seen because of an opaque surface interleaving between Evelyn, the apple, and the looking macaque? What happens when the action can only be imagined? The very same strong discharge that we heard before, and when there is no object, when no object isn't imagined, there is either no response, like in the fully visible situation. So half of this sample of mirror neurons responded like the one I show you the video of before, and that you see translated into a histogram. The remaining half responded only when the full action could be visible. I don't want to stress this too much, but since it is clearly different to see an action from imagining it, it's probably not coincidental that if you sample a population of neurons that whose activity seems to correlate with that particular behavior, looking at someone grasping an apple is active in its entirety when you see it, but only half is active when you imagine it, which I'm not proposing to suggest that imagining can be reduced in neurophysiological terms into the 50% of the real visual experience. But I would like to highlight that nevertheless, it's probably not coincidental that there is this not only qualitative difference in terms of experience when you compare seeing from imagining seeing something that you don't actually see with the quantitative level of response of a particular population of neurons. So the activation of motor or visual areas, I cannot show you the data, take it for granted. I refer to Koslin and the work generated by Koslin work. The activation of motor or visual areas during mental, motor, or visual imagery, in my hands, qualify as forms of embodied simulation, which define, in my according to my hypothesis, the experiential backbone, not only of what we perceive, but also of what we experience by merely imagining. So what this results, there's a lot more than that. I mean, I need to greatly reduce. I apologize for being crude and very concise and superficial. But I mean, there's a lot more than that that I show you. All these conjures in suggesting that the boundary between what we call the real physical world and the world of fiction, the world of representation, the world of digital reproduction, the world of paintings, of sculptures, of movies, and the like, this boundary is far less sharp than one might have thought. Seeing real action and their representation share the activation of parts of cerebral circuits they use in common. And in macaques, as I showed you before, this holds true even at the single neurons level. This dual neural activation can be described, as I described it, in terms of neural reuse and of the correlated notion of embodied simulation. Let's look for a minute at this image. Let's explore this image. Okay. So this is a static image. The static image in which, if we had more time, we would have the possibility to appreciate more the details of the expressions, of the faces, of the characters, of their bodily postures, of their mutual gazing, whether someone was gazing at us or not, where does the light come from. All this is part of a static image, but this image of an instant is transformed into a story, becomes a narrative. What kind of narrative it is? My proposal is to tell this story as the story of a movement that comes from the past, a movement that continues. It is projected in the future that is not in the picture, but it's in our imagination when we look attentively to an image like this. So we recognize the instant as part of a movement that has a past and a future. What is the past? The past is the movement that has taken all those bodies, all those limbs, up to the moment which is depicted in the image we are observing. But there is also something within this image which is protentively projected in the future. And how can we translate, how can we literally try to imagine if we can embody the future of that movement, of which that image is a snapshot, but is more than a snapshot, is a moment with a past, which projects into a future. The future can be reduced to the predictable spatial trajectory and final point of arrival that those bodies or limbs will plausibly reach after a time which is naturally inversely proportional to the kinetic energy deployed. This is all in that image. And this is all in that image because it is simulated by our brain body, because of the motor potentialities that our brain body can express. So by means of embodied simulation, the image is transformed into the figure of a story. Okay, that's just a possible, I use this as a case example of how we can try to apply this approach to interpreting images and how we can possibly provide a neurobiological grounding to the way we want to frame the topic. What do I get from that image? But even before that, how do I get things from that image? I think what our contribution can be the greatest is not probably so much into the what do we get, but in how do we get what we get. So a jump, we are in Marseille, in the lab of Bruno Viker, which if it somehow now or later on we'll have the venture to see this part of the talk, I say hello, a big hug. Let's hope to gather soon. This experiment was made in Marseille because in Marseille there was an excellent setup to study olfaction. We wanted to generate the subjective experience of disgust. We wanted to study disgust, and the question was to which extent, whether and to which extent the brain mapping of subjectively experienced disgust would be activated when I'm witnessing the disgust of an actor pretending to be disgusted after inhaling from a glass containing a transparent liquid. And we discovered that in the anterior part of the insula, that you see in this, so the joke I was making back then was that the color code was not coincidental because Bruno is French. So the white is the overlapping voxels that are activated both when participants subjectively experience disgust or when witnessing the facial expression of disgust appearing on the screen of the computer they were looking at. Here's another example done one year later in Parma, this time, where we showed that the same area, the second somatosensory area, of course, activated when we touched the legs of our participants, is activated also when they looked at the legs of someone else being activated. This was the very first demonstration of visual tactile mirroring in the human brain. So the mirror mechanism is wider than the mirror neurons I show you in the macaque brain I started with. It maps the sensory aspects of actions, emotions, sensations of another onto the perceiver's own neural mapping of those action, emotion, or sensation. And this mapping enables one to perceive the action, emotion, or sensation of another. This is the hypothesis, as if, in a way, performing that action or experiencing some content of that emotion or sensation, caveat, which doesn't imply emotional contagion. When I speak of embodied simulation, I do not imply emotional contagion. Mirroring can lead to emotional contagion when the braking system are released. And so we become emotionally ecopraxic for a moment. But this is not the rule. Most of the time, we don't respond in an ecopraxic way to the gestures of others. We are not contagious emotionally when we see someone laughing. We can, but in It doesn't happen all the time. So the notion of simulation does not contra an argument raised by Dan Zahavi. It doesn't entail necessarily contagion. Okay. So the bodily contingencies posed by the specific configuration of the human body not only constrain our behavior, as I said, we cannot fly with this body, but also constrain what neural mechanisms can map. And by neural reuse, different brain areas participate in different functions through their dynamical engagement within different brain circuits. So when I'm disgusted, my anterior insula kicks in. When I see your disgust, my anterior insula also kicks in, but in the two different phenomenal experiences, the very same anterior part of the insula dynamically connects with different, partly different brain networks. And that explains because different phenomenal experiences of disgust correlate, at the very least, with different patterns of activation in brain networks that nevertheless share some key ingredient, functional ingredient, in this particular case of disgust, the anterior insula. So a given cognitive function can be supported by a variety of brain circuits, and according to Michael Anderson, the newer in evolutionary term a cognitive function is, the wider is the brain circuit underpinning it. So the activation of embodied simulation, in my spelling of it, is the non-conscious recall of the background bodily knowledge that we recruit in several different situations, when witnessing others' action or the expression of their emotion and sensory experiences, when remembering past experiences, when planning future action, when engaging in fictional experiences, when processing linguistic descriptions of facts, actions, and events. All these situations imply, at some level, embodied simulation mechanisms. So, provides a unified account of non-verbal and verbal, I didn't cover language, of course, I didn't have time, aspects of interpersonal relations that likely play an important role in shaping the self, its identity, and its shared cultural practices. It reveals a unified functional mechanism which connects physical reality with imaginary or represented fictional worlds, and links at the functional level symbol making and symbol reception. So, for example, when I am obsessed by this Blombos piece of ochre, it's probably not the oldest. Actually, there are shells that are even older than this piece of ochre, which strikingly, although found in a totally different part of the world, share the very same geometric, gestaltic forms. I am obsessed by these forms because they are incredibly old and terribly the marker of a big jump forward of our species, namely the transition from tools to symbols, to symbolic artifacts. So what happens when we look at such a graphic sign? Well, we demonstrated that we unconsciously simulate the gesture that has produced it, and this unconscious response includes bodily framing and sensory motor activation of the simulating kind. This happens when you look at alphabet letter, Chinese ideograms, or scribbles, all handwritten. This activates the motor cortex of the beholder. Specifically, it determines a mu desynchronization recorded with high density EEG. The same occurs when we behold these cuts on a canvas, or when we behold these very dynamic brush strokes from Franz Klein. It happens when we look at the scene filmed with Steadicam, even when the Steadicam moves in an empty room, we still see motor simulation in the spectator's brain, which means that you walk along with a walking camera, and that nicely correlates with the phenomenal experience that spectators report. So what I show you very, very briefly is proof that when we are engaged in beholding man-made images, there's something happening. There are many things going on. One of the things that is going on, and to which people have not paid enough attention historically, also theoretically. I mean, the body is the key protagonist of aesthetics in the late 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the aesthetics of Einfühlung. Einfühlung, empathy, comes from the aesthetic debate. But then for more than 50 years, the body evaporates. Art is conceptual. The body is a text. It's the time of structuralism. It's the time of the Greimas semiotics. Now we have a cognitive semiotics, which speaks very different words. In Italy, there's a very active cognitive semiotic community as we speak that has a very active dialogue with people like me or a philosopher like Sean Gallagher or Dan Hatto. What is important is that the body, even at the time of body art, the body was not in the theoretical discourse on art. Things have changed. And so I think also the time has come not only to investigate whether we know it happens, to which extent the bodily engagement plays a role in our aesthetic experience of man-made images or more broadly cultural artifacts. But the time has come also to test to which extent when we are asked to provide an apparently detached, objective, cognitively driven aesthetic judgment of artistic beauty of a given image. Are we sure, are we entirely sure that the body switches off and that everything interesting is happening at the mere cognitive, conceptual, linguistic level? So we weren't happy with that answer to our question. So we decided to start investigating the role of bottom-up, bodily driven sensory motor processes in the explicit evaluation of aesthetic beauty. So to this purpose, we selected a group of faces that we took from famous paintings from the 15th and 16th century. And we selected two kinds of faces, faces expressing physical pain and faces not expressing any particular emotion, neutral faces. And we asked our participants to look at those faces and to express an aesthetic judgment. How artificially beautiful do you think this image is in two conditions, when they were relaxed or when they were actively frowning while watching and judging? And the results clearly show that when you are actively frowning, you tend to see the paintings reproducing physical pain as more beautiful with respect to when you do it with your facial muscles totally relaxed. But this bodily manipulation does not affect at all your aesthetic judgment of beauty of the neutral faces. It doesn't make a difference here if you frown or not. So the effect seems to be specific. It's not just that by frowning, you focus more your attention, you perceive details that when your face is relaxed, you would have not appreciated. And this is explained because you ask specifically tend to see more beautiful the paintings when you frown with respect to when you are not frowning. The effect is specific for physical pain. And even more interestingly, we found a significant correlation between this effect and the scores in empathy or in the art experience questionnaires. So participants' empathic traits and art experience correlated directly with the amplitude of the motor enactment effect on the aesthetic judgment of the artistic reproduction of physical pain. Very recently, a couple of weeks ago, we published an fMRI study with a slightly change of paradigm. So this time, in order to keep short the fMRI session, we asked the very same participants to provide the aesthetic judgment of beauty immediately outside of the scanner. On the scanner, they were looking at faces. Their job was to say whether that face was showing pain or not. And they could see a picture showing people in pain or relaxed, or a painting showing faces in pain or relaxed. So no art pain, no art neutral, art pain, art neutral. And to make a long story short, the observation of facial expression of pain, both of artistic and non-artistic pain, activates brain regions that we know to be related to empathy for pain, namely the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. Interestingly, the higher the activation of empathy for pain brain regions, the higher the aesthetic judgment of artistic beauty of painful facial expression. But we weren't able, for example, to find such a significant correlation if we focused on the ROI placed on the fusiform face area, namely a purely visual area which responds selectively to the observation of faces. Increase of activation of this area, which of course was activated because they were looking at faces, did not correlate with the aesthetic judgment. The aesthetic judgment nevertheless correlated with the activation of the brain circuit for the empathy for pain. So I'm almost done. To conclude, man-made images are the locus of virtual interaction, constituting a sophisticated form of mediated intersubjectivity. These elements are connected to the function of embodied simulation. The ways through which beholders connect to images are not just offline mental processes, but primarily online bodily forms of intersubjectivity. The meaning of images does not depend only on concepts and proposition. It largely does, but not exclusively. It relies also, as I hope to have convinced you, on sensory motor schemas which get the viewer literally in touch with them, shaping a multimodal form of embodied simulation which exploits all the potentialities of our brain body. Embodied simulation as a model of perception imagination generates, in my opinion, the peculiar quality of the embodied seen as that plays a significant role in aesthetic experience. And it is one important ingredient of our appreciation of human creative expressions. So I hope to have shown you that cognitive neuroscience can bridge nature and culture by studying the brain-body mechanisms that support the creative process and the reception of its results. When studying the brain-body in relation to cultural artifacts and their reception, I think we can contribute to a better understanding of the building blocks of aesthetic experience and the genesis of aesthetic concepts. Thank you for your attention. I apologize if I was too long, but this is not a matter for a TED talk, clearly. Thanks.